Welcome to the second episode of the Warrior Philosopher podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Machiavelli and more specifically his work, The Prince. And we're going to compare it a little bit to some modern events that are taking place right now and the overall implications it has upon how people come into power, how people maintain power, and the fact that a lot of the practices from The Prince, like many old works, like The Art of War, are used today. And starting off with this, I was a little bit hesitant to discuss The Prince because I feel that a lot of times a lot of people, including myself initially, write him off as not quite a philosopher and more someone who is writing a political treatise that is almost like a direct handbook on how to govern, rather than any sort of abstract ideas that we can analyze. But after further review, it's a lot more complex than that, and I think we'll be able to get some good information out of this. So before we get started, I'm Patrick Hamilton. I'm joined by my good friend Brandon Williamson, and this is the Warrior Philosopher.
Hey guys, I'm Brandon Williamson, and before we begin, I wanted to give a quick plug into our new Instagram page, which is @TheWarriorPhilosophers. If you guys have Instagram and you've been enjoying our content so far, I'd encourage you guys to go head over to the app and give us a quick follow and maybe like some of our posts. The edits that you may have seen on our channel, we're going to start posting more of those edits on the Instagram page, and it's just going to help hopefully get the podcast and the page overall a little bit more outreach. So please head over there.
Yes, and that will be in the About section of the channel. We have a link to that right now, so definitely check that out. All right, so getting into The Prince, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you think what Machiavelli... So, all right, before anything else, The Prince was written for, I believe it was... I'm trying to remember his first name. It was on the tip of my tongue. It was dedicated to the de Medici.
Yeah, it was
Lorenzo de Medici. That's right. So The Prince was originally written as literally a direct handbook on how, an Italian prince could govern, based on the different things that Machiavelli experienced at the time as not only a statesman but then an observer after he lost his position. So could you just briefly give people a quick introduction into the life of Machiavelli, basically, how he was initially part of the government, then his fall from grace, and then his experience as a writer?
Yes, so Machiavelli started off, first of all, he lived in a very influential time in history. He lived in the late 1490s, is really when he was big and when his works ended up being published and stuff. And as you guys may or may not know, that was a very big time for the world, the Renaissance world. You had lots of influential figures at the time. He lived through and worked with the Borgias, Lorenzo de Medici, as we already spoke about. And this is really during the peak of the Italian Renaissance. And it's also a time when you see a lot of turbulence going on the Italian peninsula. You had the Papal States trying to expand their power. Meanwhile, the Venetian Republic and the other republics and Florence, right? The other kingdoms on the Italian peninsula as well were fighting back against the Papal States. And you also had outside powers trying to vie for more influence on both the Papal States and on the Italian peninsula as a whole. For example, you saw a French invasion, which Machiavelli actually writes about a lot, as well as Spanish influence on the Kingdom of Naples, also which Machiavelli writes about a lot. So Machiavelli originally worked with and started analyzing the Borgias, and that's really where his...
It was Caesar Borgia, specifically,
it was
Cesare, who was the son of the Pope at the time,
yes,
which
Alexander.
was Pope Alexander.
Pope Alexander, yes. And he was working along with Cesare Borgia, who was, if you may or may not know, the Borgias were very ambitious people, and they were almost power-grabbing, right?
Oh, 100%.
Yes.
Cesare Borgia was an incredibly cunning and, at times cruel, very much like, if anyone's ever seen the show Game of Thrones. He's like a Littlefinger, Peter Baelish kind of character, someone who's willing to do whatever it takes to not only expand his power but maintain his power.
Yes, and during this time, Machiavelli wasn't just a statesman, but he also had a high position in Cesare Borgia's military. And he worked on several military campaigns, notably the Siege of Pisa. And after that campaign, he kind of had a fall from power. He ended up being resigned to house arrest after
Cesare Borgia was deposed.
After Cesare Borgia was deposed and defeated. And it's football season, so that if you were wondering what that noise was...
Turning off the fantasy football notifications for now.
But... and while he was under house arrest, that's really when he began writing these works. He didn't have... Obviously, being under house arrest, he couldn't be a statesman, he couldn't be a general. So he decided to look at the world around him, study history a lot, and compose his greatest work, which was The Prince. Now, he also composed a couple other works.
The Discourses?
Yes.
And just really quick, the Discourses compared to The Prince was written more of something that you could apply to, I wouldn't say a dictatorship, but an autocracy, essentially, while the Discourses worked more in the lens of like republicanism and democracy.
Yes. And because he lived through a very turbulent era, the Prince is very focused on maintaining stability within an empire, right? As well as how to effectively conquer other territories, because he saw the French fail to conquer the northwestern part of the Italian peninsula, and he as well saw the different city-states on the Italian peninsula fail to conquer each other. Overall, he composed this, and he initially wrote it as a gift to Lorenzo de' Medici. He, in the introduction to The Prince, he writes about how he doesn't really have any gifts to offer to de' Medici because de' Medici is a very rich and powerful man. Mm-hmm. So he wrote this guidebook, essentially, for de' Medici to learn how to govern.
The sad thing is that de' Medici basically, dismissed it as folly. Mm-hmm. And, building off of this, a lot of people today, a lot of historians, and I don't agree with this, think that The Prince was written as satire.
Yes, which I don't agree with.
Yeah, no, I think that's for lack of better words, stupid analysis. Because, just look at how many. Now, you could argue it's satire in the sense that he didn't believe this was the best way, but to say that his teachings weren't effective is ridiculous. Because you see how many people, and for bad reasons, mm-hmm. use these teachings to not only increase but maintain their power.
Exactly, and Machiavellianism ended up being factored into a lot of nations' politics afterwards, right? For example, it was hugely influential. The KGB adopted, if I'm remembering correctly, Machiavellianism as a policy within themselves.
It's interesting you bring that up. The word Machiavelli or Machiavellian mm-hmm. is kind of related to like cunning now, yes. Right? When in reality, I would say that Machiavelli's work is a lot more nuanced because obviously he talks about the ends justifying the means and all this. Yes. And a lot of historians from modern lens interpret this as doing whatever it takes to not only maintain and expand power. So much so you mentioned the KGB, right?
Yes.
Adopting a lot of these principles. But I do think that the Prince and Machiavelli's views in general are a lot more nuanced and
definitely
a lot less straightforward, just ruthless ambition,
Yes. And I think it's great that we are discussing him because this is really getting into the warrior side of the warrior philosopher, right?
Absolutely.
The last episode had a lot of philosophy in it, and this one is going to lean a little bit more on the warrior side, as the viewers the listeners will hear.
I don't want to differentiate because I think both are tied into each other.
Very much so.
Mm-hmm. Right. So before we go further into this, let's analyze Machiavelli's view of the different kind of principalities, mm-hmm. which was the hereditary one.
Yes.
There was the one that was a republic before mm-hmm. and became a principality. And then was there one more or was it just those two main ones?
And yes, and then he starts to differentiate into the different types of ways that people came into power as well. Those are huge to him. So he has he differentiates between an autocracy and a republic. Those are his mm-hmm. two main ones. And then from there, how the autocracy came about.
Right.
So you have like we had mentioned, there's hereditary autocracy, there's an outside power conquering, there's a private citizen growing up to conquer his nation, there is somebody eventually taking power by crime.
Right. He talks about how that's, I think he said the soft approach. I forget exactly the word he used, but it's kind of that manipulating different people and not attaining power based on your own means, but based on others. Is that what you're referring to?
No, so that is definitely up there as well. So he does talk about using what he refers to as prowess, right? So it's stratagem within the political strategy rather than military strategy.
Right.
So there's rising up via your political prowess, and there's rising up via your military prowess. Those are also things he differentiates upon. But what he meant, what I was referring to in rising up by crime, that's not just manipulating people via statecraft. That's literally rising up via crime. So the examples he gives for that was a man who a man who took control of Syracuse, and he did it by bringing all of
the senators.
Yes,
and
all
such.
of Syracuse at the time was a republic, and he brought all of the Syracuse's senators and nobles together, and then massacred all of them in the same room.
Didn't he start off I believe he started off in the military as the lowest of the low, and he actually it was a civil militia.
Yes.
And he rose through the ranks all the way to the top, and that's when he used his position as the basic leader of the military to do this massacre, right?
Exactly. And then the last sort of autocratic government, but it can also be a republic now that I think about it, that he refers to is one that is based on its religious prowess, right. And ends up not even...
It's like you don't have to work too hard to manage this.
Nobody's going to try to conquer it because it's a religious nation. Which
was a lot of Europe at the time, especially Spain and Italy.
Well, not necessarily, because what he's referring to specifically in that is the papacy, right? Or what the papal states were supposed to be, where they're supposed to emanate influence and emanate religious influence. And they didn't really have the strongest army, right? Or they weren't supposed to have the strongest army. Versus Spain was a autocratic nation that was at the time still going through the Reconquista, and was trying to expand its empire outward, or it eventually would try to expand its empire outward.
So you're talking about a purely theocratic
theocratic
right, okay,
state.
Gotcha.
Yes. He calls it an ecclesiastical state.
That's right. Right, so that's one of them as well. And you mentioned the hereditary autocracy, or the hereditary principality, which is the word he uses. And he talks about this one. He talks about taking over a hereditary principality, and he also talks about taking over a republic and the strategies necessary to do so.
Yes.
With a hereditary principality, I think he uses a lot of examples, but
Definitely.
I believe one of them was Alexander conquering the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire.
Yes.
And he basically, massacring the previous noble family, right? Because the idea is that so long as there's someone from the original principality, like a member of the original family that held the principality, they'll eventually rise in revolt against the new ruler. So he talks about that and uses the example of Darius, the previous Persian emperor, and all his family being massacred. At least I think it's all the male family, because I'm pretty sure he married at least one of the daughters of Darius, if I remember, or at least married them to one of his generals.
Yes.
There's that, and he talks about. It's crazy with the prince. There's just so much. There's so much to get into.
Yes, there's so much to get into. So a quick breakdown is, when conquering an autocratic state, there's two different types of autocratic states that he mentions. He gives the example of, at the time, France, right, which had a centralized monarchy, yes, but it also had very powerful nobles.
Exactly.
And he says this type of nation, one that has a strong noble system where all the nobles are entitled to their own piece, and the nobles are almost basically just as strong as the monarchy. This is very easy to take, very easy to conquer, that is, but very hard to hold is what he says, because you can easily influence one of the nobles and get them on your side, and then you would have a foothold in the nation. See, this is something that he is a recurring theme throughout The Prince. He says that if you can get a foothold on the nation via somebody that is already in there and somebody that may have claims, such as a noble, then it'll be rather easy to take control
initially,
because the people under that noble, you will have their support, and you will have claim to legitimacy within the government, or within that nation, not the government therein. So if you are able to win influence of that one noble, and therefore win influence of lots of the citizens, it will be very easy to take that nation. However, given that there's a strong nobility, it'll be rather easy for another outsider to gain control of a different noble and then take that nation back for you.
It's a concept that so when you have like a feudal system essentially, and you have nobles in power, based on the feudal system, you have like you have your lord, and then you have their knights, and you have their serfs, right?
Yes.
All of them are subservient to that lord, not you.
Yes.
Whereas and why that's difficult to control is because every time a noble decides to be a corrupted noble has all of the people below him corrupted as well.
Yes.
Which I believe is the word he used, corrupted. It's the idea that if a noble wants to revolt or rebel against the incumbent government, he has the support of all these people below him. All the lands are his by birthright. They're his family's by right. They're not. There's no idea of like temporary governance. This is his God-given right to this land. So therefore, all the people below him will follow him into a war against the incumbent government, which is why it's difficult to hold, because you have tons of nobles with all this power, and you have to appease each one of them, and it becomes a more difficult political game to play in the long term.
Definitely. And then the other side of that is a purely autocratic state. Now, in a purely autocratic state, according to Machiavelli, it'll be rather hard to conquer, rather hard to take control of. However, it'll be easy to hold on to. And by a purely autocratic state, I mean one that does not have a strong noble class.
And more like a meritocracy. In a sense.
No, it's because a meritocracy, yes. So it's an autocratic state where you have one person in power, and you don't really have a strong nobility system.
They appoint their own ministers.
Yes, everybody below them is subservient. Everybody is subservient to them. There's no nobles, and everybody is loyal to them. And then the example he gave for that was as Patrick said, as you said, it was Darius, and it was the Achaemenid Empire. The reason why this is going to be hard to take is because as long as that king or emperor or whatever have you is in power, the people will have something to hold on to, right? A good example of this is World War II Japan, right? Even though there may have been other powers in play, we're not going to discuss that really at right now. Everybody was loyal to the emperor. All of the citizens were loyal to the emperor, and they were willing to fight to the death for him. So that's why we really couldn't conquer mainland Japan without losing an incredibly large amount of troops, because everybody would have been holding on to the idea of the emperor, right? However, once you can take that, and once you can eliminate the emperor, sort of how Alexander did, specifically sort of how Alexander did in his Egyptian campaign, you now have the ability to put yourself into that new ruling position, and now you are the one that everybody looks up to. And then the example I'm going to give for this is, as I said, Alexander in his Egyptian campaign. After Alexander ended up dying, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended up lasting for a much longer time.
It was from about 320 BC to basically when Augustus formed the Empire of Rome. So it would have been around 320 BC to around the time Jesus was born.
Yes.
So about 300 years. And
it lasted very long. It was very hard to conquer because you have people looking up to him. Right. You have people looking up to you as their leader now.
Right. So I guess meritocracy is not the right word, but the word I was going for is that nobody has all the positions below the emperor or king are temporary. So not meritocracy, but more like you have a series of like viceroyalties. For example, let's consider this from the lens of like governance, right? If you have a country and you have 12 provinces, in a feudal state, those 12 provinces each have their own respective lord, and everyone below them is subservient to that lord. But in the second type of autocracy that we're talking about, the absolute ruler on top, they appoint governors to each of these provinces. So each governor doesn't have any divine right to rule. Therefore, the people below them don't have to follow them. So they're appointed by the king. And the reason I talked about meritocracy is they have to do a better job of governing, because they don't have the support of the people below them. All their power is given to them by the king. So they have to, generally speaking, they have to work. They have to work harder to maintain their position there. They have to do a good job, and ultimately, they're never really going to have the power to go against the king. Not never, but it's going to be a lot more difficult because they don't have a divine right to rule over the people below them. All their power comes from not only the king or emperor, but from their own skills in terms of governance. So that's why I brought up the word meritocracy. So it's not quite a meritocracy, but it's generally more merit-based in terms of getting power.
Yes.
Being appointed by the king is going to be generally... Now, it could also be based on cronyism and all this, but it's usually not based on a hereditary, inherited sort of system. It's going to be the king picking and choosing who he puts in those positions. And a smart king will not only pick someone who's loyal, but someone who's also skilled in the art of governance.
Yes, definitely. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So moving on to basically, how you attain power in a principality, Machiavelli brings up the concept of not relying upon foreign powers, or just in general. He has this idea of, like you talked about, military prowess, having your own army, not relying on foreign powers or mercenaries. And with foreign powers specifically, he uses the term auxiliary, I believe.
Yes.
Which is basically troops being lent to you by a foreign power, which he describes as almost as useless as mercenaries, because neither an auxiliary or a mercenary has any real loyalty to you. And on top of that, should they be successful in battle, you receive less of the prestige that comes from that kind of victory. So
yes.
In general, he talks about how it's a lot easier not necessarily easier to attain power, but a lot easier to maintain your power when it comes from your own prowess, your own army. Because the more you depend on other people, the more stake they have in your future state.
Yes, definitely. And another example that he brings up for this is how so a big rivalry that you had at the time was between the Papal States, Machiavelli's time, was between the Papal States and the Republic of Venice. Right, the Republic of Venice, if you guys didn't know, is actually, for a rather small city, had colonies all throughout the Mediterranean and a considerable amount of influence.
Yeah, very wealthy.
Very wealthy. And during the conflict between these two nations, France ends up being brought into the equation. Right? And as France gets brought into the equation, it helps. I believe it helped Venice out in their quest to keep the Papal States in check, and specifically their quest to keep Caesarea Borgia and the Borgia family in check. However, by doing it, it destabilized the region, right? And then the same mistake is repeated later on when Spain gets brought in, and Spain ends up taking over the kingdom of Naples. And as you see these outside powers coming in and destabilizing the region, these city-states actually end up bringing their own demise. Even though they're trying to win the outside power on their hands by inviting them to influence the area, really what they end up doing is they end up giving themselves earning themselves less credit, as well as this outside power that is typically more powerful than the people that are bringing it in is going to be able to exert its influence. And another example I'll give of this is a rather modern day example. So what you currently see happening in Ukraine, for example, right? On one hand, Russia's actions have brought in global attention, right? And this is bad for This is bad for Russia, right? Obviously, the global attention that Russia has brought upon itself has led to sanctions. It has led to the support from outside nations, specifically the U.S., in the form of armament, which has really made Russia's time very difficult in this war.
The armament of the Ukrainian military.
Yes, the armament of the Ukrainian military. However, on the other hand, Ukraine and President Zelensky bringing in outside support helps Putin with his argument, his somewhat propagandic argument that the Ukraine is just a puppet of America and that they have been working with America for corrupt reasons and so on and so forth. By President Zelensky asking for outside support and receiving outside support to the scale that he has, it helps give credit to Putin's argument, in addition to the way that has destabilized the region.
Right. I think that another thing, since you brought that up, when you consider most of eastern Ukraine, like the demographic that supports Russia, I would, now that you mention it, I'm thinking about that a little bit, and it could certainly be used as very effective propaganda to help sort of build this idea, like you said, that Ukraine is just an extension of the West for these Eastern Ukrainians who are more supportive of Russia. It gives the idea that there's foreign influence in that region, and simply it just builds more fervor within themselves to want to support Russia rather than Ukraine. So that is an interesting thing you brought up. But going off of that, you bring up Ukraine, and I'm pretty sure you have more that you want to bring up with that. In terms of Ukraine's political history, for the past, let's say, it really goes, if you want to get into Ukraine and Russia, of course, it goes back hundreds of years, right?
Yes.
But more recently, I think that starting with not only the fall of the Soviet Union, so Ukraine regaining independence, and then especially the past 20 years, in terms of Ukraine's people and government shifting both towards Russia and towards the United States, you see, if we want to talk about Ukraine being a stable power, regardless of the times in history, because there have been times when the Ukrainian government has basically been a puppet of Russia and a puppet of the West.
Yes.
But never their own independent entity.
No,
in a sense.
No. So far, you haven't really seen that. Although you haven't seen it be, although you haven't seen that process bear fruit, what you have seen is you have seen the Ukrainian people fight for their independence, and fight for their autonomy, fight for their sovereignty over their own nation. You had revolutions in 2004. You had
the Orange Revolution.
Yes. You had the revolution in 2014 as well. The one that was covered on the documentary Winter on Fire, I believe is the name of the documentary.
Who's the director for that?
I don't remember who the director was, but it was. I remember watching the documentary after that revolution took place in 2014, and slowly but surely you have seen the process of democratization within Ukraine, like true democratization. Obviously, after the fall of the Soviet Union, you did see democracy, but the democracy wasn't,
Russia's considered a democracy.
Russia's also a democracy, right?
Officially.
It was on that scale. And it's interesting because Machiavelli covers this concept as well, that it is much, much more difficult to take a nation that has fought for its freedom and is used to freedom than it is to take a nation that has constantly been almost slaves, constantly not...
Or is ruled by an autocracy.
Yeah, ruled by an autocracy.
Historically.
Not independent people that have independent freedom, but rather subjects is what they would be considered, for example. Right? And go ahead.
Actually, just going off of what you just said, if you look at... You take China, for example.
Yes.
They were a dynasty. They were basically a dynasty, or they were ruled by a series of dynasties for all of their history, essentially imperial dynasties. So when you have Chiang Kai-shek versus like Mao Zedong, you have the Chinese Civil War. Turning to a more communist style of government wouldn't have been that much of a stretch for people who have already lived in autocratic states for the entirety of their existence.
Definitely not. And then turning back to Russia and the Soviet Union, you saw that same exact process. Right. You had people that were used to living under a Tsar in a very feudal system, serfdom, legitimate serfdom. Even though Tsar Nicholas had abolished the...
Yeah, he was trying to make reforms.
Yeah, he was trying to make reforms. Even though Tsar Nicholas the First had abolished the system of serfs, by the time Tsar Nicholas II came into power, it still hadn't come to full fruition, and you still had princes running their principalities within the Russian Empire that still mistreated their subjects very badly.
It's a very ingrained system.
It was a very ingrained system. So the turnover from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union, another very autocratic state.
Very natural.
Yes, was very natural.
And if you think about it, a lot of those same concepts of serfdom were to an extent carried over within the Soviet Union, because you have, certain areas where they have, because essentially in communist states you also have a hierarchy. It's just a little different. It's more like the example of the autocratic state where you appoint ministers, because then the person in charge, which would be Stalin, would put certain people in positions of governance over certain regions. So it almost becomes like that sort of thing.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, get rid of one political elite and replace it with another.
Exactly.
Which is not based on hereditary dynastic foundations, but rather is based upon the choice of the supreme leader of the entire country.
Exactly. And then from there you have the difference not only within the people of who's dependent on the government versus who's independent as people, but you have the same thing going on within the nobles, right? For example, if I turn back to the French example that Machiavelli gave, the nobles there were not very dependent upon the king. The nobles were rather independent because it was a feudal system. They had their own land that, as you said, Patrick, it was like their family land. It was their blood right to rule that land. They weren't very dependent on it. Versus you turn to what could be considered nobles, would the better term would probably be oligarchs in the Soviet Union time frame, right? Or in modern Russia, these oligarchs, these secretaries of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, they could be considered nobles at the time. They were very influential. They were very powerful.
The equivalent of a noble.
Yes, they're the equivalent of a noble. But they were also very dependent on their government, right?
Well, it's like the second example of an autocracy. They're dependent upon the person in power to maintain their influence.
Exactly, right. So, as we mentioned earlier, it is much easier to take and much easier to conquer a autocracy with a strong nobility than it is to take an autocracy without one. So the way that a leader, according to Machiavelli, keeps stability within his nation is by keeping those nobles dependent, right? By keeping those nobles dependent of the government for their positions, dependent of the government for their power and their authority. And if you let them get independent, that's where you can see the rise-ups. That's where you can see one of the nobles claiming that they probably have a right, or not they probably, that they believe that they have a right to the throne. Also,
all the nobility is usually related to the previous king in one way or another.
Yes.
A lot of them intermarried, so much so you look at World War I, everybody involved was first cousins.
Yes.
Or were first cousins, I should say. So it's very realistic that they probably do have some sort of claim on the throne as well.
Exactly. And if the way that you keep them dependent, if a good modern example of this would be, again, I'm going to turn to the Russo-Ukrainian War for a solid modern example. So Russia is undoubtedly an oligarchy, right? It has a very strong, it has a very rich class of people that would be considered within their nation the ultra rich,
right? That
have a strong amount of power and a strong amount of influence. And as you saw at the outbreak of the war, especially when things started to turn to the worst with economic sanctions going on, one of the actions that Vladimir Putin took was by confiscating all of the assets and nationalizing all of the assets of the oligarchical class. And by doing this, he keeps the oligarchs dependent on the government. He sends out a strong message of, hey, I have the ability to take your power from you, so you must obey my orders, you must obey my law. And by doing this, he helped to delay and or prevent a possible coup, a possible revolution, right? If he wouldn't have done this, and if he would have left the oligarchs with their power and with their power structure, there was a much larger chance that these oligarchs could have, not only just by using their assets, but just by just by believing that they're not under the government as much as they were, to rise up and try to take claim.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because a lot of people believe that the oligarchs would oppose the war after. I heard a lot of talk about this, like, oh, don't worry, the war won't last long. After sanctions affect the oligarchs in Russia, eventually they're going to influence Putin's decision to end the war. I heard this argument before, but I think what the Russo-Ukrainian war showed us is that Putin's hold on the country is a lot more powerful than people would imagine in the past. This argument that the oligarchs would somehow have an influence to end the war were completely wrong. Now, this could also be because they don't want to end the war. They might have their own embedded interests in the conflict that ultimately in the long term will actually result in benefit to them. But there's also the aspect that it is because Putin has centralized his power to the extent that they are dependent upon him, and rather than him serving them, they're serving him.
Definitely.
But just to go back really quick, I think a better example of the don't bring foreign powers into a country would be the Vietnam War, because that was completely South, like the South Vietnamese army, or I guess it would be called ARVN, right? The Army of the Republic of Vietnam.
Yes.
Was almost inconsequential over, at least early on in the war. Towards the end, when the United States pulled out, they took up the brunt of the conflict. But for the majority of the war, it was the United States military that was fighting it, and the fact that ARVN was basically inconsequential overall. The fact that the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnamese government, was bringing in this foreign force to fight that war completely delegitimized them in the eyes of virtually all Vietnamese, so much so that the Viet Cong, I think we mentioned this in last week's show as well, the Viet Cong was a South Vietnamese fighting force.
Yes.
And so to an extent, you see that even South Vietnam, even the Republic of Vietnam, their populace supported the North more so than they supported the incumbent government of their country. So that, I think, is a really good example, because the fact that they were completely relying on the United States military completely delegitimized their ability to claim to be the sole government of Vietnam.
And you can look at examples of this, further examples, all throughout history, specifically American history.
Mm-hmm.
Afghanistan was the same. President Hamid Karzai of Afghanistan was, even though he had strong Northern Alliance and strong tribal claims, he wasn't looked at as legitimate to much of the country because he was backed up by America. Same with the Shah in 70s Iran.
Right.
Same with, as you currently see in South Korea and North Korea on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea has backing that South Korea is a U.S. puppet because of the presence of U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula. Now, I mean, without a doubt, South Korea could, with how large its army is, could stand its own on North Korea in the current situation.
It's kind of our fault,
barring nuclear weapons.
It's kind of our fault, though, originally, that what you're talking about is 100% true, but it's our fault because Syngman Rhee originally wanted to pursue a super aggressive stance against the communists, and he wanted to invade the North, but we made the South Vietnamese military so weak because we were afraid
South
of them.
Korean,
the South Korean military so weak. We purposely were making them weak because we were afraid that Syngman Rhee was going to pick a fight with the North.
Yes.
So that whole issue was technically our fault, which is kind of funny to think about.
Definitely. And even within the South Korean government right now, there's a huge contention between whether or not American troops still need to be on the Korean Peninsula.
Right.
And that various political parties, whether they're hard-leaning right or left on the Korean Peninsula, have different views onto whether or not that it should stay.
Right. And you see this concept to an extent in Japan as well.
Yes.
Now that they're I forget if they. I don't think they officially got. Did they officially get rid of Article 13, or is it just that they made amendments to it?
I think they just made amendments to it.
Yeah, I believe
don't
so
know
as
if
well.
They officially got rid of it yet.
Yeah, which is a shame that Shinzo Abe was, unfortunately assassinated, because he was also a big proponent of remilitarization of Japan. You take the military base U.S. military base in Okinawa. A lot of them hate the fact that it's there, right?
Yeah.
they definitely don't like our presence there. So just a lot of these countries that undoubtedly needed a U.S. military presence at a time at a certain point in their history. Now there's this argument that maybe they don't need it, but then of course you have the People's Republic of China becoming incredibly powerful and expanding their influence. So there's just a whole debate and a lot of ambiguity around that particular topic that we could spend hours going into. But see, this is why the Prince is such a nuanced piece of work. There's so many lenses that you could look at it from, and so many different aspects of current events that you can apply it to, which is why it's not just this one track.
Oh, definitely not.
Ruthless dictator's handbook.
Yes.
And so do you want to continue on this topic? Because something I want to bring up at some point is the idea of morality that Machiavelli brings up.
Okay, we can delve into that right now.
For sure. So what I wanted to talk about in terms of that was, and this is something you hear echoed by a lot of different philosophers throughout history. There's been this, especially after the Middle Ages or after the medieval ages, starting with the Renaissance and then especially going into the Industrial Age, was this idea that Christian morality was not compatible with governance due to the fact that morality would not allow you to do the more, Machiavelli would call it cruel or ruthless things necessary to maintain power.
Yes.
You have Nietzsche, for example, who was a big critic of Christianity, and he talked about how his idea of Christians as being these weak, subservient individuals, right, due to their morality.
Yes.
And Machiavelli
that's definitely not the Renaissance, but
No. That's why I said industrial era.
Oh, okay.
I said Renaissance going on to the industrial era, and then Nietzsche was like sort of towards the end of the industrial era, I would say. But it started in the Renaissance. You see these more, you have your humanist movements, and you have the movement towards science, rationalism.
Yes.
So it started there.
As it started to move on to the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the reason I'm bringing that up, the concept of morality. The concept of morality being something that withholds leaders from doing the things necessary to hold on to power, I would like to delve into the fact that having morality and doing the things necessary to keep the people that you rule over safe, I don't think that's necessarily something that has to conflict. Like I said, Machiavelli talks about virtues and, how the concept of virtues is a little bit, it's ambiguous, and it's hard to place your intentions upon helping the people while also maintaining stability.
Yes. But if you yes, okay. I definitely obviously I agree with you. One thing I will say is, if you look at the definition of Machiavellianism, right? Mm-hmm. If I say the word Machiavellian, what comes to mind isn't what Machiavelli actually talks about. You just think of ruthless power grabbing, which, yes, okay, so Machiavelli does mention ruthless power grabbing. He basically gives a handbook to it, but there's a lot of nuances to what he's saying. And a big concept in The Prince is the use of cruelty, and the use of cruelty well versus bad use of cruelty. Mm-hmm. And using cruelty well, he describes as cruelty that is once and for all, so that cruelty doesn't need to be used again, and it can avoid cruelty in the future. And I'd say that this is something that is maybe perhaps not virtuous, but it's also perhaps not ruthless, right? So
ruthlessness, I would say, actually is a better definition of what he meant by cruel, because cruelty is kind of getting sadistic joy from doing a certain thing. Well, ruthlessness is doing whatever it is necessary.
Yes.
For the ends to justify.
Yes, that is probably a better definition. However, the word he uses is cruelty. Yeah. So I'm gonna stick with using cruelty for here, but just for the listeners, try to imagine cruelty as ruthlessness. Mm-hmm. So he mentions, yes, again, using cruelty once and for all. That way you won't have to use cruelty in the future. Machiavelli would look at the gulags in the Soviet Union, and he would not be happy with that, because that's prolonged use of cruelty.
Right.
That is being ruthless in locking up people that are dissenters far beyond what you need to do for that, versus perhaps using cruelty well would be in America during the American Revolution, tarring and feathering the Tories, right? So tarring and feathering the loyalists.
Actually, I'd go further upon that. And not to say that this was the right thing to do, but this is a reflection of what Machiavelli was talking about. I would consider the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II a sort of... That action, I think, built the foundations of the United States occupation of Japan, and why you never... Obviously, part of it was the emperor cooperating with us, but you never really saw a mass movement against American occupation to the point that it got violent.
No.
Right? And I think that for the United States, like we talked about the whole idea of trying to invade the Japanese mainland and how we would lose a lot of soldiers, it would take a long time. Doing that, dropping those bombs, was, I think that you could compare it to Machiavelli's idea of doing one horrible thing in the beginning of your reign so that you don't have to do anything afterwards. Because something like that is going to be in the hearts of, it still is in the hearts and minds of a lot of Japanese people today. You lost hundreds of thousands of people just like that. It's a horrible thing. But that has stayed within the culture. Yes. So much so that Japan has they never, despite the fact that they have a lot of nuclear reactors, they depend upon nuclear energy, they're very anti-creating nuclear weapons.
Yes,
so
anti-proliferation.
I think that would kind of mirror Machiavelli's concept of one super horrible thing in the beginning. And I personally think that I don't think you have to do that to maintain power, but it's certainly, as he's displayed, effective. But it gets into morality and how you want to...
It does get into morality, but there are situations where that... And again, you have to look at it through the lens that Machiavelli's number one goal that he was striving for was stability. Stability, right? So obviously, for a nation to be 100% stable, you do have to throw some virtues out the window.
At that time.
Especially at that time.
I will say that the point in history where he grew up, especially in Italy specifically, because Italy is not Rome, for example.
Yes.
Rome is not Italy. So Italy did not really become unified until the late 1800s under the Kingdom of Italy. So for that whole entire period of history, it was very unstable, constant conflicts over power and politics. So, of course, being the product of his culture, Machiavelli is going to reject morality in place of power in order to maintain stability, because the people, you take everyday people, they're obviously going to pick a stable country where in the long term they're going to have a better life. They're going to be able to live well, as compared to a ruler who might be virtuous and moral, but then taken advantage of by his peers and ultimately unsuccessful in creating a safe and stable country.
Yes, definitely. And then a lot of the aspects of Machiavellianism, as we discussed, there is another work on that Machiavelli produced, where he talks about a little bit more being virtuous.
The discourses.
Yes.
We'll definitely get into that. Do an episode on that in the future.
Yes.
For sure.
Yes. And it could almost be argued that they go hand in hand, the discourses and the Prince, right? The discourses is what can be employed after you've already achieved stability, in a sense, right? So it's almost like, what would be a good example of this?
You could argue. So Vladimir Lenin, for example, wanted to create an incredibly authoritative state, but
yes.
he did see the end goal of his movement being a relatively free.
Yes, final stage Marxism.
Yeah, exactly.
Final stage Marxism. So yes, there you go. Marxism,
very flawed, but
obviously, neither of us are advocates for Marxism in the slightest.
Absolutely not.
But it's Machiavellianism could compared to this Marxism, where
I'm sure Lenin definitely read The Prince and attributed a lot of those practices.
And yes,
absolutely,
yeah,
he
absolutely.
did. Look at what happened to the Tsars. That's a clear handbook clear page ripped out of The Prince.
Yes, massacring the current royal family.
Except they killed the women and children too, which Machiavelli would not. I don't think he would have. Well, at least due to the fact that a lot of Machiavelli's views towards politics are masculine in terms of he sees the ruler as a man.
Yes.
He probably wouldn't have killed the women children. He probably would have killed the boy children.
Yeah.
But, just... he wouldn't have been as brutal as Lenin. Lenin's, constituents. I think.
No, I totally would agree with that.
Yeah. That's a funny thing, though. Because Russia was so behind the rest of Europe, they were still in a state that Machiavellianism applied to them.
Yeah.
Right? Because a lot of European states at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution were a lot more advanced, a lot more enlightened. Like, Russia never really went through an enlightened period, it seems.
No, not greatly. I mean, you did have enlightenment.
Of course.
Yes.
But they still were a feudal state, and feudalism was pretty much eliminated from every major European kingdom.
Yes.
So, yeah. Just wanted to clear that up.
So going back to the applications of Machiavelli's thoughts and ideas in modern times, right? You look at another thing that he talks about. So Machiavelli, if you haven't been able to pick up on this, he was very much a cynic. I think that's a great way to describe him. Not cynic in the philosophical concept, but cynic by the definition that he believes that people are after their own power, or that not after their own power, after what's best for them. Would you agree with that?
I see what you're trying to say. I think based on his works, absolutely. Yes. Because like we said, we don't know the extent of how much he believed in what he was writing. Some people argue that it's satire. And while we both agree it's not satire, there could be these elements. Like, there are certain contradictions within The Prince. For example, we talk about religion, right? Just saying that a religious state is more stable is almost a contradiction to this idea that, religious morality is weak towards the overall governorship of a region. But yes, based on his work, I would say that a lot of what he's espousing is that, yes, people go, it's like Nietzsche, the will to power. Everybody is working for their own personal gain, and the person who leaves morality at the door and works towards attaining their power by any means necessary will ultimately be more successful. So yeah, I would agree with that based on his work, at least, and based on what he's arguing in The Prince. That would be his point of view towards that.
Okay. Yes, definitely. And another concept that Nietzsche had, specifically towards war, was the concept of when he's mentioning sieges.
You mean Machiavelli?
What did I say?
You said Nietzsche.
Did I say Nietzsche? My bad. I meant Machiavelli.
Right. I got you a little confused there.
Machiavelli, when he mentions sieges, he talks about how the subjects react during sieges. Right. And specifically, he mentions that in prolonged sieges, you will see the subjects start to fall into almost a sunken cost fallacy. The subjects will eventually start to believe that, especially in a total war type of siege, right? So he brings up the example of sieges in the Holy Roman Empire, which obviously wasn't united, when the different German city-states would attack each other. And the example I'm going to bring up is, again, the Russo-Ukrainian War. I just think it's super great to apply a lot of Machiavelli's concepts to.
Right.
It's pretty easily to see that it's a total war going on. So you see a lot of destruction,
absolutely.
From both sides, right? So
more so for Ukraine.
More so for Ukraine. Whether or not you guys are following the news, just yesterday morning, the bridge that tied Russia to the Crimean Peninsula was blown up, right? Mm-hmm. But anyways, in a total war, what you will start to see is the subjects of one nation fall into a sunken cost fallacy, and they'll believe that because they've already lost so much, it's really going to be hard for them to lose more, and they have to keep on fighting because of the effort that they've put in. They don't want to lose it. And not only that, but it's just human nature for them to believe that because they've given so much for their leader and for their government, they will naturally expect that their government will do good for them afterwards. And why I bring up the Russo-Ukrainian War is because you look at how the Ukrainian people are behaving, and they've lost so much, and they continue to fight, and they continue to fight also because of the way that Zelensky has led, right? Zelensky has led saying that he's there for them, saying that he's encouraging them. It really hasn't been hard for Zelensky to lead during this time, I would say. He just
because you have a unified front.
He has a unified front.
Yeah.
And this is something that Russia needs to pay attention to. And I'm not arguing for Russia. I'm not a Russophile. I'm also not.
Well, if you're a Machiavellian, you'd offer your services to whoever.
Yes, perhaps.
Or whatever Italian leader who wants unity.
But that being said, this is something great to look at, right? So you look at how the resolve of the Ukrainian people probably isn't going to fall.
No, yeah. Well, it's funny because even within the Prince, he almost describes patriotism to an extent. You know, like you said, during the sieges or during wars, and bringing people together. Nothing brings together a country like a war because that's one common identity versus another.
Yes.
Right? So you take, regardless of how you feel about Ukraine, it's clear that Ukrainians feel Ukrainian.
Yes.
You know, because the idea with Russia's invasion is they believe that Ukraine is a part of Russia. But the way that you could see whether that statement is right or wrong is based upon the resistance of the Ukrainian people. So, you know, Russia might say Ukraine is a puppet of the West. If that were true, when you say someone's a puppet of the West, you're talking about the government. But when, you know, the majority of your people are actually fighting for that government, then that kind of disproves that argument as a false, you know, falsified argument.
Yes.
Disingenuous.
And when you look at Putin's standpoint, one of the things that he believed would help him, and one of the things that a lot of other people would help him in his conquering of Ukraine, is that Russia and Ukraine share a very similar tongue, right? They also share a very similar culture
And history.
And whatnot. So you even saw, it's very arguable that the Kievan Rus is where a lot of Russia came from, right? It's that the culture and everything from there. However, and this is something that Machiavelli talked about too. Machiavelli did mention that it's very easy to take a nation that you share a similar language and similar culture with.
Right.
However, when you look at Ukraine as of late, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, they've started what they call de-Russification, right? So you look at, especially at the beginning of the war that just broke out, Kiev, right, as it used to be spelled and called, they've changed the spelling of it, right? So you look at maps produced 5 years ago, and Kiev's probably going to be spelled Kiev. Now it's very hard to find a reference outside of Russian media that spells it that way. Now it's spelled Kyiv. And you can look at other examples of other cities in Russia that are following the same path. Right. Not Russia, other cities in Ukraine that are following the same path. So you see this de-Russification, and that's making it very hard for Russia as the Ukrainians have established their own unique identity.
It's funny that you mentioned, I like to say it's funny that, I got to think of a better filler word, but Ukraine has really maintained this idea of being Ukrainian for a long time.
Yes.
Even during the time of the Soviet Union, and I think part of this was because of how badly Stalin, I believe, treated the Ukrainians.
The Holodomor.
Right, it was basically a genocide.
Yeah.
When Nazi Germany invaded Ukraine, a lot of them initially saw them as liberators. Now, unfortunately for them, you know, Hitler hated the Slavic peoples and started, you know, mistreating them as well. But initially, they were very supportive of him just because of how much they hated, you know, the Soviet government. And, you know, I don't want to call this a Ukrainian versus Russian thing, considering Stalin was Georgian and, you know, the Soviet Union as a whole was kind of trying to turn away from nationalism.
Yes.
They're almost globalists, workers of the world unite and all that. But the idea of the Ukrainian people feeling separate from Russia, feeling like their own individual identity has existed for a long time. Even if you look at the ethnic makeup of Ukrainians, if you go back to the Viking Age, you had Rurik the Great.
Yes.
I don't know if they call him the Great, but I'm going to call him the Great because I don't know his nickname. Rurikid, because that's what his dynasty was called. Basically, he invaded all the way from... he originally came from the Norse areas, and he conquered all the way down into eventually his descendants would form the Kingdom of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of Ukrainians, you'll see ethnically they look a little bit different from Russians. A lot more of them are blonde, for example, because they have that Norse blood, whereas the Russian people, as an ethnicity, have existed for a long time separate from that. So even if you go back into their history, there's still a lot of differences in terms of, where they come from, their background. So the argument that Russia, or at least Putin, has right now, that they have this shared language, shared ethnicity, all that, I think that could be disproven just looking at the historical background of the foundations of Ukraine.
No, definitely. And if you even, it's funny that you brought up World War II, right?
Mm-hmm.
You even saw Ukrainian battalions in
the SS.
In the SS,
right?
Full Ukrainian battalions.
You also saw lots of different. It was basically anyone who was against. A lot of anti-communists would join the SS. Even I believe they had around 30,000 people from North Africa and the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just people that didn't like the Soviet Union, right? But no, that's something to consider as well. So it's just it's this history of conflict, not this history of unity that Russia has been talking about. I think the bigger issue when you look at Russo-Ukrainian relations is the fact that Russia has wanted to maintain Ukraine as a buffer state from the West.
Mm-hmm.
Should Ukraine join NATO, for example, or the EU, I don't know which would be worse for Russia, but one of the two, then you lose that buffer in between the West and what they would consider themselves the East. Like Belarus, for example, is one of their buffer states in between Poland and Russia,
mm-hmm.
and that's why they're so invested in. I believe his name's Lushenko, the dictator of Belarus. They fund him. They fund his regime to maintain that buffer state, and I think that's why Putin and his constituents are so concerned with the state of Ukraine, because if he loses Ukraine, he loses that integral buffer point
mm-hmm.
between the West and the East.
Without a doubt. Right.
So he uses his Machiavellian strategy to try to keep it.
Yes, and another Machiavellian doctrine that could be considered to be employed in this current Russo-Ukrainian war is Russia's nuclear doctrine. And what I mean by this is Machiavelli talks about how there's different ways to govern nations and different ways to conquer nations that lived under their own laws, is the phrase that he uses. That means that they govern themselves, right? That they were their own political entity, certainly as Ukraine currently is. And one of the ways that he mentions to do this is by moving and putting your capital there, such as how the Turks did to Constantinople. Obviously, that's not really a possibility for Putin. He can't just vacate Moscow and move the Kremlin to Kiev. He also can't let them really be their own thing, right? He wants to try to annex them. Especially,
he's kind of tried to in the past.
Yes, he's tried to in the past, especially with the rhetoric that he's using. He can't let them maintain their government but live as a vassal. And the third way that Machiavelli mentions to conquer this nation is by completely devastating them, by completely destroying them. That way, you can basically build anew upon them, right? And this is mentioned with Rome, how Rome razed cities and salted the earth, as an example that Machiavelli uses. But it also plays into Putin's current threats with their nuclear weapons, right? They threaten to use tactical nuclear weapons, and if you look at their nuclear doctrine strongly advocates the use of tactical nuclear weapons as a show of force. And this show of force would be a way of devastating a nation, right? It would be completely destroying the will to fight, similar to our use of nuclear weapons back in 1945. And I believe that looking at the war through this lens, you can see, I'm not justifying it. I'm not justifying the use of nuclear weapons. I'm not saying Putin should use nuclear weapons, but I'm seeing how his mind, especially given his previous Machiavellian actions,
mm-hmm.
can be going in this direction.
Right. Well, I think the issue, a lot of people have right now, is they kind of think of him as this crazy guy, but he's not. He is a calculated individual.
Definitely.
And I think that if we really want to, because essentially we're Americans, so his policy is in contention with our own. If you want to adequately deal with your adversary in an effective way. You can't just write them off
No.
based on a false pretense that he's crazy, because he's not. He's calculated in his approach. He has reasons for doing what he's doing. If we don't acknowledge that, we're not going to be able to effectively counter his policies.
For sure.
So yeah, he's using these approaches. He's strategically thinking about these certain things that he wants to do in order to attain victory, and devastation, if that were to happen, would be incredibly.
It would be in line. It would be in line with what his thoughts have been in the past.
Right. No, absolutely. So, yeah, devastation, giving the populace such a memorable act of violence that you break their will.
Yes.
And there will be no more resistance after that, or at least very limited resistance.
And from there, that's where you can essentially start anew. You've been built upon the few foundations that are left, and that is how you would occupy a nation that already has its own laws.
Right. So going off of that, the idea of devastating a country to give yourself the legitimacy of ruling over them, what are your thoughts towards the other options that Machiavelli puts forward? For example, within the, like you talked about, like you used the example of the Ottomans.
Yeah, the Ottomans. Yeah, right. So when the Ottomans moved their capital to Constantinople, they didn't. Obviously, there was some ego reasons for it too, right? A big reason was they saw this beautiful city and they thought it would
represented Christian resistance towards the Islamic invasion.
Yes.
At the time.
However, by moving there, the future emperors of the Ottoman Empire had a much stronger ability to keep track of what was going on in these newly conquered areas of the Balkans, and then slowly, as they moved towards Central Europe, even up to the gates of Vienna, they had a much stronger grasp of what was going on. Because it was really fair to say that being Muslim and being the current strongest Muslim caliphate of the world, that they had a stronghold over the Middle East and North Africa. That wasn't incredibly necessary to look after as much as it was the threat in the Balkans and the threat in Central Europe. So by moving your capital to there, as Machiavelli says, it gives you a much stronger ability to see what's going wrong when it goes wrong, instead of hearing about it from your emissaries or hearing about it from the people. You're hearing about it from a middleman. It eliminates the need for a middleman. Mm-hmm. Another example of this would be
Alexander.
Yes, Alexander, right? When he moved his capital to Babylon, right? It helped him to be closer to the front. If he were to stay back in
Macedon.
Back in Macedon, Macedonia, it would have not really helped him. He would have been so far from the front. Obviously, he was on the front with his troops anyways. But if he were to retire to his capital, he would have been so far from the front that it would have been very hard for him to keep current with what was going on the front.
On top of that, by moving his capital to Babylon, he's essentially, it's like the concept that we talked about before, the idea of basically taking the place of the previous autocrat.
Yes.
He's putting himself as a Persian emperor, mm-hmm. rather than a Greek. You know what I mean? Yes. You know what I'm trying to say? He's representing the people in which he has conquered, so much so that, apart from, or along with moving his capital to Babylon, he also began recruiting, Asians into his military. Mm-hmm. A lot of Persians, people from the various territories they conquered. So it's this idea of really assimilating into the region which you have conquered.
Yes, and for the last method of conquering a country that used to be sovereign, right, is by letting it govern itself still. So what this refers to is almost turning a country into a puppet state, right? Turning a government into a puppet state. Letting them still have their own laws, where you are their ruler, but you don't really change their taxes. You don't really change their laws that they have. And a good example of this is the Mongol Empire.
Right. So basically, once the Mongols were unified under Genghis Khan, and he He established his territories in the steppe region after conquering Persia. Generally speaking, he adopted a more laissez-faire attitude towards governance, and this was carried over by his successors, rather than try to change too many of like the laws that had previously been in place in these states. He generally taxed them, had them pay tribute to the Mongol Empire, but he didn't spend too much time trying to change what they already were, especially with the Mongols. Oftentimes they assimilated into the cultures in which they conquered. For example, you look at Kublai Khan establishing the Yuan dynasty in China. 100 years after they came into power, they were all the people who were considered Mongols before were now essentially Chinese.
Yes.
So it's this sort of attitude of coming in and more so adopting the either just not being involved at all to an extent, just taxing them and having them officially be part of the state, or adopting what they are and becoming a part of that culture that's already in place. And like Brandon said, the Mongols did this expertly. What they did take advantage of was the fact that they were officially one empire, so they could create a system of. They created the first postal system, essentially, with their different Mongol riders. They made the Silk Road, which was a pretty dangerous trade route because of all the different geographic challenges that came with it, going through deserts, mountains, etc. But they created systems of, I would call them just rest stations. Outposts where you could get food and where you could stay for the night. So these things they influenced, right? Things that would encourage trade, encourage the exchange of ideas, but they wouldn't go, like, you don't see any of the countries they conquered consider themselves Mongol.
No.
Right? So that's why I say would be the reason why I think that Genghis Khan and the Mongols is a good example of this.
And if they refused to accept Mongol rule, what did Genghis Khan do? He devastated them.
So
he devastated them.
That shows that you can use multiple approaches within, because, I mean, a lot of these great conquerors didn't just conquer one region. They conquered multiple regions, and you, depending upon who you conquered and how they responded, you could appropriately change your policy towards them.
Yes, and as the empire expanded, they didn't really have the central capitals necessarily, but as the empire expanded, you did see different khans moving to different areas.
Yeah,
and that was a way of him using the third one, the one that we haven't covered, the one that we haven't covered in respect to the Mongols, of them moving their capitals. You saw Kublai Khan settle in China, and then you saw like Timur the Lane. He was technically Mongol, right? Like, but
an extension. He came from that line,
right? So just the way that they spread like that.
Right. Funny enough, I'm pretty sure Kublai Khan, I could be wrong. I want to just double check that really quick, but I'm pretty sure the Yuan dynasty capital was in Beijing, if I'm not mistaken. And we're just looking that up really quick right now, the Yuan dynasty capital. Because I believe it was under the Yuan dynasty. Yep, Beijing. And I believe they were the ones who began the construction of the Forbidden Palace.
Oh, okay.
So it's funny that you even go back far enough, how much influence the Mongols had in China. The current capital, which is now the capital of a communist state, which is not at all imperial, well, at least officially, right, yeah, still maintains the same changes, the same little changes of moving your capital to the country in which you have conquered.
Yes, but just a quick note, as we see right here, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, the UN capital before it was moved to Beijing was Karakorum, the capital of Mongolia.
Right.
Or the Mongol Empire at the time. Yes.
Yes. All my homies in Mongolia.
Yes.
But so those are the different ways. And like we said, the Prince is such. There's so many ways that you can approach it, and it's so, a lot of the things within the Prince end up relate, like if you go through the chapters of the Prince, like something in the early chapters will relate to the later chapters, so it's kind of difficult to formulate how you're gonna summarize the Prince, because everything's interconnected. Some things contradict themselves. It's a very interesting work. And you just, I would say it's not too difficult of a read.
No, it's only 70 pages or so. So,
yeah.
I mean, I would definitely encourage all of the listeners to just read it. I mean, you could probably sit down and read it over a weekend or in a week, definitely, if you're taking your time with it. But it applies to so many things, and obviously, like we discussed with Stoicism and like we discussed with Epicureanism as well. Take the Bruce Lee like approach to it, just as you can to pretty much all things in life, right? And going back to that Bruce Lee quote, it's take what's useful, reject what is not, and add in what is purely your own, right? So, I mean, there's some good things to take out of Machiavellianism, definitely. You can easily see how it can be applied to everything in life, going from war to politics to, as you see with the word Machiavellian, personal relationships even.
Business as well.
Business as well, definitely with business. So, yeah, I mean, I would definitely encourage the audience to read it.
And just to summarize, like you said, this was a difficult topic to approach because of how interconnected everything within the Prince is, and I think we'll definitely come back to this in the future, maybe after we've read the discourses,
yes,
and kind of flow that together. But I think the final thing that I want to say about this is to take something out of the Prince, especially as myself from a sort of Christian morality standpoint, is that in order to provide the best for everybody, let's say you're a leader, right? In order to provide the best things for all your people and keep them safe, you have to resort to violence, for example. You have to do things that are morally questionable, but I don't think that it necessarily means that you don't have morality. You can still have your virtues and your morality. You're actively choosing to do things that are difficult in that specific time to create overall good in the future. And you could still do things for the good of the people underneath you. And you can still maintain stability while also maintaining your morality, maintaining your ethics, and maintaining your virtues.
Yes, definitely.
So I guess that's wrapping things up. Thank you for listening. This was a little bit more open-ended this time. Like you said, this is a very difficult topic to talk about, like in the sense that there's so much nuance and there's so much content within it. So we'll definitely be re-exploring this in the future. But this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the warrior philosophy. Thank you.